Christine asked me to speak about my recent trip to Palestine, which, as she mentioned, was part of a group of 23 other Christians. So I have a few, I guess, poetic reflections from the trip that are framed by two events or texts within the Gospels. The first one is from that moment before Jesus' crucifixion, before his arrest, when he's with his disciples and predicts that they will deny him. And you'll remember Peter says, "No, I will never deny you, Lord." And then, of course, later, Peter will deny Jesus 3 times. The other event or text is after the crucifixion, after the resurrection, when Jesus first appears to some disciples, and then you'll remember that the disciple Thomas doesn't believe their testimony and says, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." And then, of course, Jesus appears before Thomas, and Jesus asks Thomas, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen yet have come to believe." So my reflections are framed by those two texts. But first, maybe I'll assume everyone knows that there's a war happening in Gaza, which has resulted in the deaths of over 35,000 Palestinians, has put, although still surviving on the cusp of famine. Gaza is one Palestinian territory. The other Palestinian territory is in the West Bank. These were the results of the partition of the land in 1948. The UN partitioned the land largely because European countries didn't want to deal with what they termed the Jewish problem. Of course, this is following on the atrocities of the Holocaust, which were largely a result of anti-Semitism in Europe and the West, and the refusal of other European nations and America to welcome Jewish refugees and immigrants fleeing for safety. So instead, prior to this, there was already a movement evolving called Zionism within Judaism. Up until this point, it should be noted, most Jews rejected Zionism. But so there was already large-scale immigration of Jews to Palestine. And then in the aftermath of World War II, the UN decided to partition the land, which up to that point had been inhabited by 99% of it, had been inhabited by Palestinians and 10% by Jews. And so you can imagine when over 60% of the land is given to these new immigrants, it didn't sit well with the current inhabitants of the land. So many people think of the conflict between Israel and Palestine as a centuries or even millennia-long conflict. It's actually rooted in the last century of geopolitics. So feel free at any point to stop me and say, "I don't understand the context you're speaking to," and I'll try to explain it. But first, let's start in the old city of Jerusalem, where the call to prayer emanates from the noble sanctuary. This is the Muslim holy site. You might imagine the Dome of the Rock, that golden dome, which is often portrayed in panoramas of Jerusalem. So the call to prayer emanates from the noble sanctuary. Allahu Akbar echoes across the city, and in the Muslim quarter, the faithful lay out their rugs and prostrate themselves. And nearby, along the western wall, a remnant of the second temple venerated by Jews, head-covered prayers whisper their laments and petitions while their foreheads lean against the stone wall. And when they finish, they slowly back away rather than turn their heads, on this sanctified wall of grief and hope. And just a short walk away, the bells from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre clang while priests robed in black floor-length cassocks process into the sanctuary. And inside, the pilgrims from the four corners of the earth kneel on the ground where the crucified one is said to have breathed his last. And here in this land called holy, the histories and destinies of billions are animated by these countless prayers and stories. And to pull on any one thread is to find yourself entangled in a story too dense and too complicated to tell, and too painful to bear, and too beautiful to explain. And I'm certainly not equipped to tell it, and I confess some trepidation, fearing a misstep or a missaying. For around every corner in this land, as with all lands, as with our own land, is a reminder that language matters, and stories are sometimes matters of life and death. But that's precisely why I've come along with these 23 other Christians from 12 denominations of the church. We've come to hear a story and then tell it. Come and see, go and tell is the refrain of our Palestinian hosts. They've invited us to come and see for ourselves. And I confess a certain unease with this invitation because in our Western imagination, some stories are inherently suspect and inherently unreliable. It was the scholar Edward Said who coined the term Orientalism to describe the way Westerners view the inhabitants of the Middle East as fundamentally other, as exotic and fanatic, as irrational and violent. In particular, Arab and Islamic cultures are used as a foil to highlight the ways the white West is enlightened and progressive. And in practical terms, this means stories like the ones Palestinians tell are easily dismissed. Their calls for liberation from occupation, basic human rights, and statehood trouble the stability and consistency of the white and Western superiority. It's incomprehensible to our imaginations that their suffering and death could be at the hands of an enlightened and liberal world order that's based on the rule of law. So there must be something inherently wrong with them. They must be deviant. And it's this conclusion that helpfully eliminates Europe and America's and the church's complicity in the ongoing slaughter in Gaza and their support for the deadly and decades-long occupation of the West Bank, and even the anti-Semitism that insisted Jews were a threat to Europe and America and discarded them while propagating a lie that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. So come and see, the Palestinians say. And the reason that they have issued this call is rooted in the very fact that the Western Church has not trusted their testimonies, has considered them unreliable narrators of their own lives, histories, and experiences. And so we, 23 witnesses, went to see as representatives of a Western church who, like the disciple Thomas, have insisted, unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe. At mid-morning, I ducked through the door of humility. This is the low entrance to the Church of Nativity, where tradition marks the spot of Jesus' birth. And I'm alone except for the low groan of the liturgy being chanted in the underground grotto, which lies just beneath the head of the church. This is the precise location that tradition marks as the birthplace of Jesus. And this strikes me as unusual, the fact that I'm alone. for this is one of the most significant churches and holy sites in the entire world. And I've been here before, and usually there's tour groups bustling through. Mostly they are Christian pilgrims whose buses pull up next to the church. They get out and hustle through the church, then hop back on the bus. Bethlehem isn't safe, so they've been told. Their Israeli tour guide will take them to a gift shop where they'll receive a generous cut of the sales, and that's the one and only foray into the West Bank. A quick in and out, having completely missed any chance for encountering an actual Palestinian Christian, or any Palestinian at all. In any case, typically there are long lines to descend into the grotto. People pray before the spot where Jesus is said to have been born. But this time I'm alone, and outside the church, Manger Square, which is lined with shops, those shops are also closed. There are no tourists. It is empty like the church. Since the war in October, the economy in Bethlehem and the West Bank has collapsed. I head back toward Lutheran Christmas Church, where we are staying. There we meet with Reverend Isaac Munther Isaac. Over Christmas, there was a viral photo of the baby Jesus amidst the rubble. Reverend Isaac did that. He explained that he placed the baby Jesus there as a pastoral act, to answer for his parishioners the question that they have kept asking since the war on Gaza began. Where is God in the midst of this catastrophe? God is in the rubble, he said. God, in the form of the baby Jesus, is alongside the suffering and the dead. He told us that story, and then he looked at us and said, I know where God is. God is with and alongside the dead and suffering in Gaza, but I want to know, where is the church? After the Last Supper with his disciples, Jesus predicted that they would deny him, but Peter insisted that he would not. Jesus knows his ministry and mission will be dismissed as fanatical, as extremist. The occupier and colonial power of Rome will narrate his body as a terrorist, as a body worthy of crucifixion. I read Jesus' prediction about his disciples' denial as both a warning and a plea. Please do not forget me. Please do not forget to tell the story of what really happened. Do not let the Roman Empire have the last word. Tell our story, continue the mission. The drive to Ramallah is only 15 miles, but it takes us over 2 hours. Navigating the ever-changing checkpoints is a daily task. Some are open, then they close. Some are closed, then they open. When we arrive, we meet with Military Court Watch, which is an organization made up of lawyers from Palestine, Israel, the US, Europe, and Australia, focusing on children held in Israeli military detention. 1,100 testimonies of children have been collected by Military Court Watch. Testimonies that include evidence of torture, ill treatment, denial of process, and unlawful transfer. Since the decades-long military occupation began, 32,000 children have been transferred from the West Bank, a clear and direct violation of international law. The social cost is enormous. Children are coerced into confessions, told their friends have ratted them out, and then forced to turn and rat out their friends. Then they are sent back into their community as informants. But kids, even under the best of circumstances, aren't actually good informers. And that isn't the point. The point is to incite distrust in families and communities. And it's worth noting that 98% of children are detained and live within several kilometers of illegal Israeli settlements. They are arrested primarily for things like throwing stones. Settlements are illegal and settlements are expanding. And since October 7th, numerous outposts have been constructed. Settlements have increased and roads that divide up the West Bank have been constructed. And while the Palestinians of the West Bank witness their family, friends, and compatriots in Gaza die, they also bear enormous economic, social, and cultural catastrophe. It is a slow-motion catastrophe, they say again and again, as they are more and more isolated from each other and the world. Shortly after Jesus' plea to his disciples to not forget him, in his moment of greatest need, as he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, he will be left alone. His disciples will fall asleep. It is only when the soldiers arrive that they awake to the true significance of the moment. And isn't this the case for us as well? That it's only when we see the horrors on our televisions and computers and phones that the violence begins to awaken us. But all along, the structures of violence wreak havoc and death in subtle and invisible ways while the world has its eyes closed. This is what the Quaker Palestinian writer Jean Zaru observes. The structures of violence are silent, and people cannot take pictures of those. By contrast, television captures only the direct violence. The Al Rawad Culture Center lies at the center of Aida refugee camp, one of 3 refugee camps in Bethlehem. The camp was established in the 1950s by refugees from Jerusalem and Hebron. What were once tents are now buildings built atop other buildings. There's nowhere to build but up. And generations have passed, but families hold on to the keys of their homes from which they were evicted and forced, awaiting the fulfillment of their right to return. At the Al Rawad Culture Center, children dance and sing. They are used to performing for groups like ours, but groups like ours haven't visited since October. In the dance hall, teenagers perform traditional Palestinian dances. I don't know much about dance, but I know that they are impressive. I should say I don't know much about dance because there's a dozen jokes about why white Euro-American Mennonites like me don't dance. And as I watch, I curse whatever history denied me the possibility of movement and dance. For these children leap and bound, twist and twirl. The occupation and violence in general is about bodies, about constricting them, about forcing them into positions of submission and retreat, restricting their movement. Here they are unwinding the occupation, loosening the restraints that constrict them. Their movements are controlled because they are in control. And they are flowing and free because bodies that are free flow into motion, into a rhythm that prophesizes the liberation that is to come. They dance the resistance. As we begin to leave, a group of teenage girls gather around a woman in our group, and they ask her to take a selfie with her phone. They pose as teenage girls pose, and the woman snaps the picture. She offers to take another one with one of their phones, and their laughter and giggles turn toward a more serious and earnest response. They say, "No, this picture is for you. Do not forget us." It reminded me of the poem I've heard read a dozen times since October by the Palestinian poet Rifat al-Arir, who was killed shortly after he wrote this poem by an Israeli airstrike. He writes that if I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth. and some strings. Make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a story. The children at the cultural center ask to be remembered, to be storied. At the heart of the Palestinian struggle, at the heart of the struggle for liberation in Palestine, the heart of the struggle for liberation in our own country, is a struggle to be trusted. Apologies, I'm moved by their stories. A struggle to have their own stories count, to narrate their lives on their own terms, to not be denied. And the church has time and time again said, I do not know these people. I do not know these people. I do not know these people. Indeed, the theologian Mitri Rahab has written about the way Western theology has been constructed in a way that renders Palestinians invisible. Palestinian Christians, the native people of the land, he writes, were not visible in the Western Christian theology. Just as Israel erased Christian demography and geography from Palestine, so Western theologians erased Palestinian Christians from their theology as if they had never existed, as if they did not belong to Palestine, and as if they were aliens in the Holy Land. But they are there in this land called holy. And I have seen it with my own eyes. I was asked to come and then go and tell. So blessed, I say to you, are those who have not seen, yet have come to believe. Amen. So now it is time to go and tell. So as we go, why don't we take an inhale and an exhale? A reminder that simply to breathe, to inhale and exhale is already to participate in the life of God, is already to participate in the divine life, to participate in that life that is justice, that is peace. So go in peace into this world, breathing loveliness and justice and peace. Know that Christ goes with you. Amen.